it's hard to enjoy that nice weather when you're quarantined.
Yeah.
Hey, Alex, I saw in the film, you guys got the girl from Vida, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I thought so. Okay.
Chelsea Rendon.
Yeah.
Right.
I didn't recognize it without the blue lipstick at first because she has it in on Vida. Oh.
It's so interesting, their being and their presence acting, you know, where sometimes you meet an actor and they're just nothing like their character.
Yeah.
But then sometimes you meet people and you're like, whoa, it's like you're still your character, you know. So she's like, doesn't have the blue lipstick on when you meet her, but she's very, you know, her spirit is a lot like Marty, the character from Vida. And I think coincidentally also a lot like Vidi, the character in our film. I mean, the two of them, when you see them on stage, are really like cut from the same cloth. It's they're both very like outspoken and just
I can definitely see that.
Spirits, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've seen her also on a couple other shows where she kind of plays a similar character from like Mari and Vida, and so seeing her in y'all's film, I was seeing her in a different light.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, I really liked her performance.
Yeah, it was. I mean, obviously, the reality of the story was that, you know, you see it in the film that Vidi stayed out when Marco went in for the first few weeks, and so we get more real Vidi while Marco is inside, inhabited by the actor, you know, in our film.
Yeah. So we're gonna start in 1 minute, y'all. We're live on YouTube now, just FYI.
All right.
But keep talking, and then I'm just gonna, you know, interrupt shortly. Just want to give you a head up.
Yeah. No, just saying that it would have been equally interesting to spend more time in the women's side of the detention center, but
for sure,
the facts of the story were that she was in for about half the time that Marco was.
Yeah, well, that makes sense.
All right, so we're gonna get into it. We are so excited. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited about tonight's program. Hello, my name is Jessica Green. I am the artistic director of the Houston Cinema Arts Society, and we are doing this evening's program in partnership with the Houston Latino Film Festival, which is an amazing organization that does an amazing festival. And tonight we are doing a Q&A with the directors of The Infiltrators, which is a brilliant movie, which continues on our platform through tomorrow night. So you can watch it today, you can watch it tomorrow, continues through Thursday through the Houston Cinema Arts Society. And we have the incredible directors of the film, Cristina Ibarra with us and Alex Rivera, who are the co-directors of The Infiltrators. And we also have Antonio Alaria, I'm gonna say this, get his name right, Arellano, and he'll tell me if that's wrong, who is a incredible human rights activist, immigration activist and advocate and expert, and voting rights activist and expert. And we also have Pedro Rivas, who is the programming director of the Houston Latino Film Festival, who is co-moderating with me this discussion. So we're so honored. We have the artist that made this film. We have a individual, Antonio, who is an incredible activist that is doing amazing work around the issues that this film is capturing. So we're gonna get into it. I'll just like share some ground rules for the discussion. Pedro and I are gonna co-moderate the discussion and go back and forth and ask our guests some questions. And then we're gonna open it up to the chat about 30 minutes in, and we're gonna take questions from you all about 30 minutes into the discussion. So please get your questions ready. So I am gonna throw it to Pedro, the programming director of the Houston Latino Film Festival, who is going to start asking some questions. So Pedro, take it away.
All right, thanks again for having me, and thank you, Alex and Cristina and Antonio, everybody for joining us. I did want to ask, how did the project initially get developed for The Infiltrators?
Hey, well, thank you everybody involved in putting this together. Thank you for doing it in this crazy and kind of difficult time, and thanks everybody out there in the digital haze for engaging. You know, whether you're doing it live or later on. Thank you for watching. In terms of this film, you know, it's been a long journey. It started almost 10 years ago when in 2010, we saw in the news something we'd never seen before. Both of us come from families that have like some immigrants in the family, some documented, some undocumented. But in 2010, we saw in the news young undocumented immigrants getting themselves arrested and facing their own deportation on purpose. This was it was in Arizona, and this group of young people walked into John McCain's office to get arrested in a political protest for the DREAM Act. And we were sort of shocked just seeing this was happening. At that time, Dreamers were being deported under the Obama administration, and this young group of Dreamers went in and said, take us away, you know, as an act of protest. And they weren't deported. And then in the news, they went and did it again and again. And by the time they did it like 4 times, I thought this is an incredible rupture in the history of immigration. Something big is happening and I want to understand it. So set out to make a short film with this group, and they kept going and moving and doing bigger things. And so Cristina got involved and was like, this isn't a short film, it's a feature, but we don't know where it was going. And that's how we ended up in 2012 in Broward County with this group known as the National Immigrant Youth Alliance. At that point, they were at this kind of bold level of development, and they're like, we can go beyond doing sit-ins, we could do something bigger and badder, and so let's get into a detention center to get people out. Yeah. And that, of course, is the story of the Infiltrators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I got involved, you know, a little bit later on as Alex started without me, but you know, I started getting involved because I saw an opportunity when meeting the Infiltrators to do something that was really different as an immigrant story. It was showing protagonists who were not victims. You know, it was showing people who were really sophisticated political strategists. And that was really exciting to me because one of the missions I have as a filmmaker is to break down these stereotypes about border stories or, you know, immigrants. And here was this great opportunity to really dig in and try to understand what motivated them, but also to show a new representation, you know, of an immigrant story. So it was really exciting.
Oh yeah, definitely. At what point did you decide to make it like a hybrid nonfiction and narrative project? Was that always a plan or something that developed along the way as you were documenting the subjects and story?
Yeah, so like we mentioned, we kind of started just with a set of questions to understand what this group was doing, how the government would respond. We didn't know what kind of film we would make, but when we decided to tell the story of this infiltration, and we had the footage outside, we had them kind of the footage of the group planning the action and supporting it and executing it outside of detention. But half of the action took place inside the detention center. And these places are owned by corporations, they're run for profit, and they are very secretive. They don't let in journalists, they do what they can to keep out lawyers. There was no way for us to go in and make a normal documentary. So if we wanted to tell this story, we knew we had to get creative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we looked at all of the footage that we had captured throughout the couple years, Broward, that one event at Broward was really stood out. You know, it had a great beginning, middle, and end. It was very dramatic. But yeah, like Alex said, then it came with choosing that event as the story to enter into these issues was just very challenging, you know? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's when we started to explore different ways of visualizing this. You know, we thought about animation. Alex likes to draw. You know, we thought about archival, reappropriating some archival footage. We thought about combining, you know, like cutting and pasting, photoshopping things together. But yeah, ultimately we settled on actors. You know, when we saw the footage, it was really one of the scenes that really popped out was when one of the activists is preparing for a role, you know, to infiltrate. Like she has to take on this play. She has to play this part. And so we realized, wow, they're already performing. Let's go with that. Let's lean into that and see what we can do with actors.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, when she was rehearsing.
It was great.
You get so attached to a lot of these characters throughout the film. I was actually wondering how the real life characters are doing, like Marco and Claudio, Vidi, Benny, Mohammed.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, so at the end of the film, there's a sequence that kind of updates you on where folks are. So that's pretty much the situation where Marco is in New York, working at his parents' restaurant, involved in activism, sometimes nationally, sometimes locally. Vidi, the same. She's in North Carolina, continuing her advocacy. She has a group there called Alerta Migratoria.
Yeah.
You know, the biggest kind of story in terms of updating people is Claudio. You know, he was, of course, the reason the infiltrators went to this detention center was because his son reached out saying, my dad is in this detention center.
Right.
And lawyers and everyone's telling me I can't get him out and he's going to be deported. What can I do? And the activists went to get Claudio out. And that's the story of the infiltrators. He was kind of the inside man. And so after the events of the film, he'd been free in Florida, living his life. He worked as a gardener for 7 years, all the way until 2019. After the film premiered at Sundance and it was in the news nationally, he went in for one of his check-ins at ICE. What that means is an immigrant, when they've had contact with the system, like somebody who crossed the border or overstayed a visa, at some point, maybe they have contact with the immigration system, like Claudio did. Yeah. And then if they don't get deported and they're allowed to stay, they often have to do these check-ins, go into ICE and say, here I am, it's been a year, I haven't committed any crimes, can I stay another year? And they stamp your paper. That happened to Claudio until 2019, when he went in and they detained him again. And that happened last February. And so we were on this kind of high. We'd finished the film, it won awards at Sundance, and then our friend, this man that we got to know through the film, was taken by ICE, and we almost had to relive the film with the activists trying to stop his deportation, again, now under Trump, and we all failed. He was deported in April of last year, 2019, separated from his family. He'd been in the United States for 20 years. And it turns out that he's one of many, that there's many immigrant activists who speak out through the news. Trump is using ICE to target those people, to basically remove politically active immigrants from the country. And that's a violation of the First Amendment and of human decency. So we're involved in right now trying to think about how this release of the film, there's a legal campaign and a political campaign and various things going on to try to figure out how to create pressure to bring Claudio and other activists who were deported for speaking out, how to bring them back, hopefully under a future president, you know, a different president.
Yeah, thank you for that update. That's actually a good segue into some questions for Antonio, who is an immigration activist. Antonio, can you share, you know, your thoughts about the infiltrators, about this film, and especially as it relates to the southern border crisis in Texas, which you do a lot of work around? And thank you so much for joining us. We're really honored to have you with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, I think Alex and Cristina did a phenomenal job at really capturing the essence of the struggle, right? And the challenges that most immigrants face when they are captured by ICE or CBP and taken into detention centers. Here in Texas, our detention centers are amongst the most deadly in the nation. Unfortunately, while of course the Broward Detention Center is a horrible place, right, and contributes to propelling the separation of families and the dehumanization of people, here in Texas, and particularly in Houston, our detention centers have one of the highest mortality rates in the country, just because of the lack of human necessities, right? And we saw this be frontline national news here recently in the last fall and last year, where the separation of families was headline news, and we, you know, the nation really focuses on attention on the lack of hygiene products, the lack of meals, the lack of a true bare bone minimum necessities. You know, the detention centers in America run by the GEO group which is the largest private prison industry in the United States and hence the world, is a for-profit business, right? They are operating as if this is lucrative to them, because it is. They're in charge of making sure that their rooms and beds are full, sometimes overwhelmed, so that they can continue to receive federal funding. It's a disgrace. It's a violation of human rights, and it should have not just the attention of the United States, but the world. I think that particularly under this administration, we need other countries to interfere and recognize that there is human rights violations happening on behalf of the United States government on American territory. And here in Texas, we are ground zero for this. We are truly one of the center points of the fight against immigration justice. And we got to continue to advocate for these folks who oftentimes haven't committed any crime other than to seek the liberty that this nation promised. And as advocates on behalf of the immigrant community, what we're truly trying to do is make sure that America recognizes that it has a broken immigration system. And more than anything, we want America to live up to its promise of being a beacon of hope, and live up to its name, the land of the free. You know, folks often refer to our country as that, but there's many people who are not free in this country. And I think the Infiltrators does a really great job of really capturing that and depicting particularly the human and family aspect of what it means to even get a phone call from inside the detention center. And I remember, Beatty in one scene where they are actually able to bring one of the detainees back into the detention center and not even get free, just bring him back into the detention center because he doesn't board the plane. And the family is just ecstatic and so happy that he's not gone, right? And so just thinking about that is so chilling. But it's not, it's something that shouldn't just capture the country's attention when there's a death, but it should be front and center all the time, because after this webinar, we will all go back to our homes, we will all go on with our lives, but there's people behind those detention centers tonight that are going to sleep without seeing their mothers and haven't seen them in months. So keeping that front of mind is super important.
Yeah, and I mean, based on what you're saying, can you share a little bit about the work you're doing, especially thinking about one of the things about the Infiltrators that I think is so powerful is the way it's really a blueprint for the kind of activism, right? And advocacy that the Dreamers are doing. It really breaks down the tactics and the strategy. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your tactics and strategy as an activist and an advocate, and your thoughts about what is being presented in the Infiltrators and how it dovetails with your own work.
Yeah, the courage displayed by Marco and Viri really is, really resonated with me, because this nation seeks to impose its laws through intimidation tactics, and they use fear as a weapon to paralyze the undocumented community. And I think that, as undocumented people in this country, we must not allow ourselves to be paralyzed by that terrorizing of our community. Instead, utilize it to fuel our passion, our drive, our ambition, our determination to break down these barriers and seek liberty and freedom in this country. At JOLT, my organization, we're currently preparing for the most recent immigration case, which is the DACA ruling, right? And so in just a couple of days, the Supreme Court is preparing to rule on whether DACA will be upheld or if it will be struck down. And folks like myself included, who are DACA recipients, are literally living in limbo, not knowing what will happen. And what's ultimately occurring here is that the greatest court in the land is deciding whether people like me matter. And there's folks right now that are frontline essential workers. There are DACA recipients working in the medical field and making sure that they're putting their lives at risk to save American lives. In this moment, I think that organizations like mine and other organizations around the country are really mobilizing like never before, because there's so much at risk, there's so much at stake. Almost 800,000 DACA recipients are currently protected under the Defer Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And if the Supreme Court decides to side with the racism and discriminatory rhetoric that comes out of the White House, it'll be an incredibly sad day in this country's history. And more than anything, I think it'll tarnish the American dream and what it means to be an American.
Thank you, Antonio. Pedro, you have a couple more questions for the directors of the Infiltrators, right?
Yes. Sorry, I think I lost you for a moment, but I think I'm back. I had a question about how the previous work, Alex, with Sleep Dealer and Cristina with Las Martas informed this film.
Yeah, hey, I just want to also acknowledge just Antonio's comments and just how powerful I found them, and how right on I think it was in terms of the analysis of the power of fear and the production of fear as a political weapon. And if fear is a weapon that the racists want to use against the immigrant community, then images of joy and images of power are also a weapon that can defend our community and open up political possibility. And that's what we felt, seeing the Infiltrators in action. We felt it, and we hope the film reflects some of that in these times. We need it. So thank you. I just really felt your comments were powerful. But in terms of other work, so Sleep Dealer is my first feature film, and it's a science fiction, kind of a cyberpunk set on the US-Mexico border, and it imagines a future world where the border is sealed, and instead of physically coming to the US, workers in this future connect their bodies to an internet and control robots that do their labor in America. So their pure labor comes in while their bodies stay out. So it's a science fiction cyberpunk rooted in immigration politics. And obviously Infiltrators is a true story, so it's very different. However, Detention does feel almost science fictional. It's kind of a gulag, or these are basically prisons that are named something that's not a prison. They're prisons where people aren't put on trial, where they don't get a court-appointed lawyer, where the sort of rules that we think apply in the United States are thrown out the door. So it's this kind of upside down criminal justice system. And we all know the criminal justice system itself is a mess and fraught and troubled and racist and all of that. But this system doesn't even have any of those minimal guardrails on it. So it felt a little bit like approaching an alternate reality. And we wanted some of that absurdity to be felt, in our depiction of the system.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, so yes, thank you, Antonio, definitely for your comments. I guess the evolution of my work, it kind of feels inevitable in some ways to land here with Alex, because in looking at Las Martas is my last documentary, which was set in Laredo, Texas, and it was following Mexican-American debutantes. And it's one girl from each side of the border. But what they do to perform their debut is they perform as figures from the American Revolution. So they pretend to be white, even though they are mixed. And so these questions of mixed Mexican, American, Spanish, like you name it. But I guess for me, the performance of identity is something that has been very interesting to me throughout my entire career. And I found that this was the other side of performance of identity. What I was looking at in Las Martas was young women with privilege. The going back and forth between a fluid border was nothing. It was a certain class of people where the border didn't matter. It's like the border didn't cross us. I'm sorry, we didn't cross the border crossed us. It's a very Texan saying, right? Yeah. And so it was very true for them. And so in this case, we have young people who are also thinking about this sense of belonging the way that the young debutantes are. And they're also thinking about performance and their identity. But they don't have this questioning of belonging. They're shouting it. They're saying, I belong. Yeah. This look at me, I'm here, address me, deal with me, I'm here. And I found that very provocative to see the other side of the coin. And to just also look at how performance and belonging play out for all young people, but in this case with higher stakes. In this case, they might not be able to go home. And so it was, yeah, it's just an evolution in some ways that, and working with Alex has been a way to explore more of the scripted space, which seemed kind of already there in Las Matas with this, you know, pretend celebration. But anyway. Mm-hmm.
And speaking on working together, how do you guys navigate your working partnership as a husband and wife partnership, parenting and currently homeschooling of a 5-year-old?
A juggle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge in many ways, but in a lot of ways also it's such a unique experience that it helps you really grow in so many ways. And I guess I would say that I'm happy to think about collaborating with someone like Alex, because I'm so, I guess it's a shorthand collaboration because we're collaborating in so many areas of our lives. I mean, every aspect of our lives, basically, we're collaborating. So it seems kind of inevitable that we collaborate artistically in this case. Yeah, it's been, I mean, in the beginning, what we really did was we tried to take, you know, I would take the lead in the documentary when there was a documentary question, when there was this question around script, or, you know, how to do a hybrid form. Alex has this experimental background and science fiction background. So, I mean, in the beginning, it was very clear, like, you know, who's going to take the lead. And yeah, it was kind of like a divide and conquer type of idea. Yeah.
Oh.
What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A lot of talking, a lot of listening. That's all you got to, you know.
Yeah, makes for good collaboration. What's next for you guys, and what can we all do to help here with what's forthcoming?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, we're still very much, I mean, this has been a long journey, you know. It was like, whatever it was, 7 or 8 years to get to the film's premiere at Sundance, and now it's been another 1.5 years just dealing with the release of the film. And strangely, the release of the film is just beginning now, you know. And
we have a visitor. A cameo.
Yeah, so we but anyways, if folks care about the film or felt moved by it, you can watch it at infiltratorsfilm.com. We're streaming it there, and the cool thing about that link is if people rent it there, half of the money goes to Claudio Rojas, the immigrant activist who was targeted for deportation. What's that?
If you missed it this week.
If you missed it, or if you want to gift it, you can gift it to somebody else. Yeah. But that's at infiltratorsfilm.com. The film is streaming on all these different platforms and places, but at our website, infiltratorsfilm.com, that's where it benefits the activist. So people want to share that or social media that, hit it up, anything that's really helpful. Making a nice review about the film on any of the sites, that's helpful. Giving it a couple stars or whatever happens these days. And then just at infiltratorsfilm.com, we're also, we have a website and you can email us, and we're building a list of people who want to stay in touch, you know, about these issues and the campaign heading into the fall to bring Claudio and other deported activists home.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, but any of those, anything that you can do like that to support is amazing. One of the things that keeps Claudio going in this fight is to be able to tell his story. So, you know, we can, you know, keep fighting for him to come back. It'd be great.
Well, and in terms of what we're doing next, we're both making more films.
Great.
Yeah, so we've got I'm writing. I got my first writing job in Hollywood, and I'm writing I can't disclose the whole thing, but it's a legendary kind of Latino figure in pop culture, kind of a vigilante superhero. Maybe people can take a guess at who it is, but I'm rebooting that character in a kind of science fiction modality, but rooted in immigration politics and border issues, the way I always try to work. So it's like a socially grounded superhero story that I'm really excited about, and I'm writing that right now.
I'm looking forward to it already.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah. And I'm working on another feature documentary. Yeah, it's a coming of age story set in Honduras. So, still working.
Is it true that the Infiltrators is being developed into a fiction TV series?
Oh, good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So the Infiltrators, our film was optioned by Blumhouse, and Blumhouse is known for Get Out,
horror, yeah.
Horror. So they're really well equipped to deal with immigrant detention. They did Paranormal Activity and all that. So welcome to something truly horrific.
Yeah.
But their TV division has a bunch of great people involved, and they're doing more than just the horror thing. So this is more of a sort of drama, fish out of water story. So anyway, but long story short, yeah, it's being developed by Blumhouse Television as a scripted series, and yeah, they've been working on it for about a year now.
Interesting. All right, so I'm gonna ask Antonio a couple more questions, and anybody that's on the chat, please send us your questions. We want to get them in there. So, Antonio, could you talk a little bit about like the role and the importance of citizenship in the U.S., and the role in the movement for human rights, especially for Latinos and immigrants, especially people that aren't naturalized citizens, right? And also about voting, which I know you do a lot of work around, voting rights. If you could speak about those two things, especially the work you're doing, and then the last piece is, what can we do?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that opportunity to talk about that. Citizenship in America is such a privilege, and I think that we need to recognize it for what it is, and making sure that those who do have citizenship recognize the power that they wield and their responsibility, their civic duty to make sure that they are speaking out on behalf of the people that can't speak out, right? And voting on behalf of those who can't vote. This election cycle that's coming up in the next 5 months is one of the most unprecedented elections in modern history of our country. So much is on the line, and we want to make sure that everybody who is available to register to vote, both in Texas and across the country, does so. My organization, JOLT, is the leading Latino civic engagement organization in the state. We are operating out of Austin, Dallas, and Houston, with student chapters at college campuses all across the state, from the Rio Grande Valley to Dallas and everywhere in between. And we're activating our 15,000 strong members to make sure that we are advocating on behalf of our community, as well as registering people to vote. It's imperative that we do so. Citizenship and the pathway towards citizenship is a common buzzword used by most elected officials on their way around the state and across the country as they're doing their case for election. At JOLT, we want to recognize that a pathway to citizenship, or comprehensive immigration reform, includes a pathway to citizenship for not just DACA recipients, but for the over 11 million undocumented people. We can't forget about our mothers and our fathers, our aunts and uncles who don't qualify under the DACA protection. And it's imperative that we recognize that in this moment, particularly under COVID, when so many frontline folks and essential workers don't have the luxury to work from home, and that's why you're seeing an increased amount of cases amongst the Latino population in particular, that we prepare to make sure that we mitigate the impacts of that on our upcoming presidential election as well. Here in Texas, my organization, JOLT, is making sure that we are prioritizing public pressure campaigns to move forward with vote by mail and online voter registration, to make sure that people are not jeopardizing their lives to go cast their ballot. Just yesterday, the federal court ruled that Texas can have vote by mail, and it's a major win for or communities of color. And we need to make sure that they're exercising their ability to cast their ballot, to make sure that we are electing candidates and elected officials who recognize the significance and contributions of the undocumented community and begin to have the courage to pass legislation that will once and for all deliver a pathway towards citizenship. You know, our system is completely broken. Folks often talk about getting in the back of the line, but they don't realize that there really isn't a line. There's so many different obstacles and challenges all together that make it almost feasibly impossible to do. You know, there's a lot of folks who are residents and are on the pathway towards becoming citizens, but many of them are elderly folks, and learning a second language to pass the citizenship test is incredibly challenging, or even adapting to the changing circumstances and acquiring the financial income needed to hire an immigration attorney and to pay for all the legal fees. There's such a layered amount of complexities to actually acquire your citizenship that just poor or middle income Latinos in this country are really challenged with. And so we need to recognize the multi-pronged approach that needs to be taken to comprehensive immigration reform, realize that undocumented immigrants are deeply relying on American citizens to do their due diligence and vote, and recognize that the contributions of undocumented people, you know, are insurmountable, truly. You know, and this country wants our culture, they want our fashion, they love our food. Well, they need to start also appreciating our humanity and recognizing it for what it is.
Yeah, amen. We're starting to get some questions from the chat, but I want to first, Alex and Cristina, do you have a question for Antonio? And Antonio, do you have a question for Alex and Cristina? Just throwing it out there. In case you guys do. I want to make sure you guys are, you know, interacting also, in case you have a question for each other.
Yeah, we've been, I'm just curious to hear what your, you know, our film took place under the Obama administration. And I think I mentioned maybe, I'm not sure when in this, but just that it seemed like then there was an administration that you could get leverage on, or you could shame. They were obviously deporting record numbers. And my understanding is even still Trump hasn't deported as many people as Obama has. There's been other ways to measure the suffering that Trump has caused. But in any case, I'm just curious, like under this administration, do you see any leverage? Where do you see any power on the advocacy side against this administration at local levels, or what are you seeing? Because, yeah, just curious about that.
Yeah, no, you know, you're absolutely right, Alex. And it's, you know, it's important to highlight that this topic of immigration and the violation of human rights of immigrants is not a one-party issue. It has been done by both political parties in this country, and our undocumented immigrants have constantly been scapegoated to address the economic issues of the country, to address the crime issues of the country, and they try to pin it on us. Unfortunately, you know, statistics indicate that that's just not accurate. Immigrants cause less crime than nationally born Americans, and are actually more entrepreneurial than the nationally born Americans. And you're right, the Obama administration did deport more people than the current Trump administration. But what we see here with the Trump administration is just a lack of care. There's just no humanity at all in the way that they are deporting people, while the Obama administration did a genuine effort to try to deport folks with criminal backgrounds, as opposed to how the Trump administration is specifically targeting families, mothers and children, to send a chilling message to immigrants around the world that they will, you know, they won't hold back, and that they will do whatever it takes to curb the immigrant contributions and incoming population into this country. The corruption this administration has displayed so bigotedly and so openly is truly shocking. And that's why I made a call for global action. America needs to be held accountable for what's happening in this country under this administration. As an advocate on behalf of the undocumented community, it's imperative to realize that we're going up against people that are much better connected than us, much more funded than we are. And so it's really a David and Goliath story. But at the end of the day, what we do have to our advantage is that we have the numbers on our side. And soon here in the state of Texas alone, we will become a Latino majority state. We're just 3 years away from becoming the largest percentage of the population in the state. And in Texas, 1 out of every 3 Texans are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And Texas is also home to 1 out of every 5 Latinos in the country. Out of that, there is a significant amount of folks who are, having children, and 95% of their children are now American born and citizens, and soon will be eligible to vote. And so there is hope that as these young Latinos come of age, they start to recognize that they have the potential, the opportunity, the power to change the dynamics in this country and begin to reshape a democracy that benefits low-income, middle-class folks, and prioritizes the contributions of immigrants in our nation.
Antonio, do you have a question for Cristina and Alex?
Yeah. I love the film, and I would love to know more about the conditions in the detention center that you were highlighting, because it was, interesting to see how, from an immigrant perspective, that I know how bad things are, that a lot of it was not really shown, or perhaps, was that intentionally excluded? Was that part of the narrative? Or was this particular detention center not as bad as the rest? What's your perception there of how you depicted the detention center itself?
Mm-hmm. So, I'll start, but so we were really following the story and where the story led us. And so what we found through the protagonists in our story were that there were cases of abuse happening inside, and there were different, there were so many different cases, and we had to really focus on the cases that we had the most access to as filmmakers. But there were definitely cases that we didn't highlight, that showed, a lot more of the physical abuse. What we really learned about through Claudio and through Marco and Viri was a lot of the psychological abuse. A lot of the threats, like, for example, Benny, threatening his family, and, asking people to self-deport. Those kinds of threats were the ones that were coming to the surface a lot more clearly. And it's also considered, Broward is considered a model detention center, by the government itself. And so there were things that are happening, and we see a lot more of today, that we just didn't see ourselves. But it was definitely something that we were uncomfortable about, and we didn't know how far really to push that idea, because we were limited in some ways with what we were exposed to ourselves.
And just and I think to follow up on what Christina's saying, like, our understanding is the detention system back then, I think it was a little less than 200. And my understanding is today is a little more than 200 centers, and they all have very different characteristics. But I think Broward is an outlier. It's painted pink. I don't know how many other ones are pink. In Broward, there's 6 detainees to a cell, and they have a bathroom. I know a lot of detention centers have 100 people in a giant room with just cots as far as you can see. Or we've seen images of people sleeping on the floor with silver blankets in a pile. I mean, Broward is an exceptional facility. People are still incarcerated. And right now in the news, it's coming out, there's a big COVID infection. A detainee there just filmed himself on cell phone saying they want to kill us all in here. So that center needs to be known what it is. It's a prison, but it's a pink prison. And they do have, a little bit more freedom of movement. They do have a little more privacy. I think it's a center that has some basic, a modicum of civilization, as opposed to some of these other ones we've seen where people sleeping under bridges and things like that. So it's an exceptional facility, but like Cristina mentioned, the story led us there. And I think it's a risk of our film that an audience member thinks the whole detention system is like that. We hope they don't, but the point of view of our film was always to attach to the infiltrators and the activists, and that's where they were. So we didn't want to like step away from them and like do a whole national profile of the detention system, because we disconnect from the characters. So this was our struggle, is like we're depicting an issue in which there's not enough representation. But because we're doing a character-driven depiction, we're only going to see a little piece of the system. And it might be a shortcoming of the film, you know, because Broward is not like the rest of the detention system.
So I think this is, speaking of activists, I think this is a question for Antonio. We have a question from Al Bell. I think this is for you, Antonio. Could you please explain the government policy or law behind the fact that a person can be held in detention without any legal rights?
So I loved, there was a section of the film that actually touched on this a little bit, and I encourage folks to also look deeper into this, because it's a good flag for everybody that's involved or cares about the immigration system. So Customs and Border Protection is twice the size of the FBI. So like just let that sink in, right? So Customs and Border Protection is twice the size of the FBI, and it's the largest law enforcement agency in the world. And most immigrants don't get a right to a trial or a court because you're undocumented. And so those rights they're given to American citizens. Like if you're an American citizen, you get a trial. If you're an American citizen, you get a court-appointed lawyer. If you're undocumented, that does not apply to you. And so, here in Texas, this was news recently. There was children as young as 2 years old defending themselves against a judge. Right. So like the judge is like asking the child, like, why do you deserve to be here, and why should you be freed, by themselves, because they do not qualify under the American law for legal representation that's free or pro bono. And so oftentimes we do have a system that is unfair and unjust to folks that are coming to this country with absolutely nothing. So imagine you coming into America, and then you leave everything behind. You get detained, and then you lose everything you have, including your monetary assets. So you don't have money to buy a lawyer, and then the system does not give you a lawyer, and so you're having to defend yourself in a foreign country that speaks a foreign language that you do not understand. It's just a horrible situation for most undocumented immigrants. We have a shortage of immigration attorneys at the border that are able to deal with these cases, and it's truly such a dehumanizing way of treating people that are simply seeking opportunity and asylum in a lot of cases. Women who are fleeing violence, families who are terrorizing their native homes to come to America because they've heard of the greatness of this nation, to be met with this rejection and cold and vitriolic rejection. Is just so un-American. It should not be like this. It should not happen like this. But yeah, the American system is flawed all the way down to the lack of representation and the lack of legal counsel that undocumented immigrants receive. And it's why we have such a backlog of cases.
If I can maybe, is it okay if I follow up real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
This week on PBS, there was this fantastic series, Asian Americans, right? And it's totally worth watching because it connects to this question. And but basically, this question of why immigrants don't get these basic rights goes back to Chinese exclusion in the late 1800s. And students of history would know that Chinese exclusion is the first immigration law. There was no, like people say, oh, my grandparents came legally, Well, before Chinese exclusion, there was no control on immigrants. It didn't exist. And then they passed this racist law, no Chinese. And then this set of Supreme Court cases occurred after that law to define, well, how do you administer this racist ban? And there was a court case at the US-Mexico border where a Chinese immigrant wanted to return home, they kept him out. He tried to get access to the courts and they said, you know what, you're not an American and you're not in America, so you can't access the courts. You have no standing. And that was the first of these Chinese exclusion Supreme Court cases. Then the second one was an immigrant where he was inside the US, a Chinese immigrant, and he didn't want to register with the government and comply with this racist order. So they said, we're going to deport you. He went to the Supreme Court fighting his deportation. Fascinating story. But the short version of it is they said, even though you're here in the United States, you're basically like that other guy who's outside. So even though you're physically here, legally, you don't have standing or jurisdiction the same way someone else does, a citizen. And so if you get it in your mind, like this idea of these detention centers filled with immigrants, they're almost like people who are here, but legally cast out of the core protections. Mm-hmm. And that Supreme Court in the 1880s that made these decisions, legal scholars know that was a crazy racist court. Mm-hmm. And most of the decisions reached by that court have been thrown in the dustbin of history for being backwards racist thinking. And these decisions that upheld the logic of Chinese exclusion, that's what underpins the whole detention and deportation system today. And those decisions need to go in the dustbin of history as well, but anyways, just.
Yeah, everybody that went through Ellis Island was undocumented, basically. Yeah. But it's unacknowledged. And shout out to Houston, where actually it was a case in the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, that went all the way to the Supreme Court that led to the designation of Mexican American. That actually was a case, an individual in Houston fought for that designation, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So it's thanks to Houston that we even have the term Mexican American, actually, which is also a little known fact of history. And also Antonio brought up, women that have dealt with violence. Just wondering, speaking of which, do we know what happened to Nima from the Congo? Is there any information on what happened to her?
Yeah, so we have some non-conclusive information that we couldn't verify. And so Nima is really a composite.
Okay.
Some of the women, but the inspiration for her, there's a lot of information. Yeah, she was deported, but she may have come back. I mean, it's very unclear what really happened. But even Vidi, who's close friends with her, she can't confirm.
Got it.
We don't know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. Okay. One more question. This is from Brian, and then I'm going to throw it back to Pedro for any last questions. Pedro, think about any questions you want to, final questions you want to ask, and then we can close out, my co-moderator. But this is a question from Brian. For the filmmakers, how did you decide to use actors rather than have the participants play themselves? And how did you cast them? Did you try to find actors with experience in the US immigration system or not?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll start, but I mean, one of the things that was important to us when using these two genres and mixing them up is that we didn't want to create a film that was going to be confusing or hard to follow. It's really important for us to have narrative clarity, so that people could understand when we were in scripted space and when we were in documentary space, and then just it wasn't about the form. The film wasn't asking you to think about why we're doing this. It was just done out of necessity. And so one of the reasons that we chose actors, as opposed to maybe the real protagonist, is that it was clear when we were in that space. At one point we considered using the real people, but realized it was not going to work, because one of the things that we are really proud of that we do with this hybrid form is that we try to stay as much as we can in the present tense, where the clock is always ticking forward. So whether you're in the scripted space or you're in the documentary space, you're just passing the baton over, but you're not like reflecting on a flashback so much as you're just keeping the actions moving forward. And so it was important to do that with actors, you know, so that we wouldn't get lost.
Yeah. Yeah, and we think of I think of beautiful films like The Act of Killing and films like that that, you know, use documentary and kind of performance inside of the documentary form, and they tell a story, but they ask you to think about performance and memory and film. And we had enough to think about with, look at this story of organizing inside this detention center and watch these badass kids attack a detention center, and let's see how they do it by infiltrating and having a victory, and then leveraging that victory to organize and build a campaign. And we wanted the audience to stay with the story rather than sort of lean back and sort of scratch their head or fiddle with their beard and think about film, form, and memory and performance, you know. So like Christina's saying, the decision we made were for clarity, and also actors can bring real emotion, and we think they did. And even, you know what I mean? So in a way, like having real people play themselves is interesting, but often becomes more of an intellectual kind of thing or an exploration about that rather than let's stay in the story and feel it and live it.
They're also really busy. They're working. They're activists.
Yeah. That too.
Sure. Yeah, no, for sure. Although, I mean, that said, the Infiltrators and the Act of Killing would be an interesting double feature. Interesting. Double feature for Americans, especially, to, you know, in terms of like the global American story that Antonio was talking about. So Pedro, any last questions you want to ask our guests? You know, take us home, close us out.
Yeah, actually, before we wrap things up, I do have a question for both of you, Alex and Cristina and Antonio. During this time right now of, you know, COVID-19, coronavirus, how do you see it affecting, Alex and Cristina, your art now and filmmaking process going forward? And for Antonio, how do you see it affecting your activism and everything that you have to do happening now and also going forward? And I'll start with you, Alex and Cristina.
For me, like I mentioned, I'm writing in this kind of superhero, for lack of a better word, modality. And so it's so interesting to be writing a story about a masked Avenger in an age now where we're all masked. And so that's odd and weird. But at a deeper level, because I think both of us have been concerned about the border and, you know, basically like I love that Antonio used the word freedom and liberty, because to me, that's what immigration ultimately is about. An immigrant is expressing a desire for freedom, to move, to be with a family, to work, to find hope, or just for whatever reason. But to me, moving, what my father did, what my family from Peru has done, moving around the globe to find hope, is liberty. It's a type of freedom, an expression of human dignity. And we're going to see a very dark thing unfold right now with this administration and many around the planet using this virus as a weapon, a mind weapon, to make the public more afraid of movement and that kind of freedom and dignity, and using this virus and this pandemic to create bio borders and a new landscape of fear. And we're going to have to, as communities that care about immigrants or who are immigrants or connected to them, we have to produce something other than that. We have to produce an alternative vision. And that comes from activists, advocates, artists, all of us, like produce a vision of freedom and dignity and decency, because the hate machine is going to use this virus, and already is, in very powerful ways.
Yeah, no, it's hard to really respond to that with this kind of with Alex's prophetic fear and inspiration at the same time. Like, it's like I'm still thinking about his thoughts, because right now I'm just thinking about practicality. It's just like, okay, I just have an hour to practice my filmmaking, because other than that, we're just like juggling life, and that in itself is just not I feel like I'm still going through it and not sure how to respond artistically or creatively. Realizing that there will be, just like we found this hybrid form, we will have to find new ways of telling stories that work in this limited space that we're in right now, whether it's archival or I don't know. I'm still thinking it through, but right now it's just about like getting through the day. But I'm curious to hear what Antonio is thinking these days.
Yeah.
That's a great question, Pedro. And most people say, I can't wait for COVID to be over so I can go back to normal, so I can go back to business as usual. Well, let me tell you something. For people like me, back to normal, business as usual means our communities continue to be discriminated, dehumanized, taken for granted, overlooked, and killed without impunity. I'm not ready to go back to normal. I think that this opportunity presents us with a chance to begin to create what a new normal looks like. I think that our systems have all been pushed to the limit. A lot of our systems have been broken and shattered. Many of us are mitigating this by working from home. All of the normal routines of everyday life have changed. And it's imperative that in this moment, activists, advocates, community leaders begin to recognize that we are presented with an opportunity to begin to reshape the future of this nation, that we have an opportunity to begin to rethink and reshape the way our society operates and our society moves about and how we move forward from here. And as far as I'm concerned, at my organization, we are working hard to continue to innovate and to pioneer and illustrate what the future of this country looks like. A community that is multicultural, that embraces Black and brown bodies, that recognizes the contributions and the significance of undocumented and documented immigrants alike. And I think that what we can do in this moment is remain hopeful and optimistic in the face of so many challenges, so much oppression. I think that it's imperative that we begin to have bold and fearless leadership that calls out for a modern emancipation. And that's what we're creating. We're liberating our people in the way that we can. We can't afford to fall into negativity, despair, and depression. We can't give away our freedom, our laughter, our joy. Nuestra cultura, nuestra gente es hermosa. We're beautiful, we're powerful, and we can accomplish anything. And I think that in the midst of this moment, we can continue to thrive, and we stay forward, and we stay focused on how to continue to build that future that we all long for. And I think that if we do so, and we maximize this moment that we have at home with innovating strategies and continuing to share and amplify our stories, we will seek to achieve just that, and we will be able to achieve a place in our society where there will be opportunity and prosperity for all.
Thank you, Antonio.
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to conclude on. I want to thank you, Alex and Cristina, for the Infiltrators. And I want to thank you, Antonio Arellano, for everything that you do. And Jessica, thank you, and the Houston Cinema Art Society for allowing Houston Latino Film Festival to be a part of this. And for those listening, go out and watch Infiltrators.
Yes.
Infiltratorsfilm.com. There you go.
There you go. Thank you all for having us.
Thank you guys so much. It's been great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.